A weary Navy SEAL and his loyal dog left the city behind after years of loss, never expecting their journey would lead them to a quiet town forgotten by time. There lived a lonely old man who had buried his heart after losing his only son.
What do you want?
When the soldier and his dog appeared at his doorstep, the old man looked at them with cold eyes, as if painful memories had just returned. But then something unexpected happened, and the dog did what no one in the entire town could do. What began as strangers crossing paths slowly turned into a story of healing, forgiveness, and a small miracle that changed everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more meaningful stories. And now, the story begins. The road into Pine Hollow wound through the northern mountains like a pale ribbon laid across sleeping earth. Snow lay along the shoulders of the road in soft ridges, not deep enough to bury the land, but enough to remind anyone passing through that winter still held the mountains in a quiet grip. Adrian Vale drove slowly. The old pickup truck hummed beneath him, the engine steady but tired. The heater breathed warm air across the windshield, melting the thin film of frost that formed whenever the wind shifted. Beside him sat Ranger. The German Shepherd filled the passenger seat with a quiet, grounded presence. At 5 or 6 years old, Ranger had grown into the kind of dog that seemed less like a pet and more like a companion carved from instinct and patience. His coat carried the layered colors of sable shepherd's cream, gray, and black blending together like shadows in snow. Amber eyes watched the road, ears lifting occasionally when the wind rattled against the truck. He wore a working harness black with dark red trim along the edges, the color almost burgundy when the light struck it. The handle across the top showed small signs of wear where Adrian's hand had gripped it many times before. Ranger didn't bark. He rarely did. Instead, he watched. Adrian glanced at him briefly, then back to the road. The mountains felt different from the cities he had left behind. The air smelled cleaner pine, snow, and distant water. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt patient. Adrian Vale was 35 years old, tall just over 6 feet, and built with the kind of strength that came from years of training rather than vanity. His frame was lean, efficient, and controlled. No unnecessary bulk. The body of someone used to moving fast and surviving hard terrain. His face was clean-shaven, the skin pale but weathered by cold climates and years outdoors. A square jaw framed his mouth, and high cheekbones gave his features a disciplined sharpness that never quite softened, even when he smiled, which wasn't often. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a military style, though a little longer than regulation now. It curled slightly at the edges where the wind caught it. But it was his eyes people noticed most. Gray-blue, clear and steady. They were the eyes of someone who had seen more than he talked about. Today, those eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. A wooden sign appeared at the curve of the mountain road. Pine Hollow. Population 1,284. Adrian slowed. The town revealed itself slowly after that, small houses tucked among tall pines, smoke rising from chimneys, a diner with warm yellow windows glowing against the pale afternoon sky. The town looked calm. He felt Ranger shift slightly beside him. "You feel it too, huh?" Adrian murmured. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. The truck rolled down Main Street, tires crunching lightly on snow dusting the pavement. A few people turned their heads. Small towns always noticed newcomers. Adrian parked near a diner with a faded red sign that read, "Caldwell's Kitchen." The moment he stepped out of the truck, the cold air cut clean across his face. It wasn't the biting wind of high mountains. It was the quiet cold of northern forests, dry, still, and watchful. Ranger jumped down from the truck with fluid grace, landing lightly despite his size. He stretched once, nose lifting toward the wind. Then he stood close to Adrian's side, always just a half step forward, always aware. They walked into the diner together. The warmth inside felt immediate. Coffee, cinnamon, and fresh bread filled the room. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s, Martha Caldwell. Martha was tall for her age, with broad shoulders and strong hands from decades of working in kitchens. Her hair had once been chestnut brown, but now carried threads of silver woven through it. She kept it tied loosely at the back of her head, and flour dusted the sleeves of her sweater. Her eyes were the kind that noticed everything. Kind, but sharp. She looked Adrian up and down once, not rudely, just assessing. Then her gaze dropped to Ranger. "Well now," she said warmly. "That's quite a dog." Adrian nodded politely. "Name's Ranger." Martha leaned slightly over the counter. "What kind of dog waits that still in a diner doorway?" "Working kind," Adrian said. Ranger sat beside him without command, amber eyes calmly scanning the room. Martha smiled. "Good manners, too. We could use more of those around here." She poured coffee before Adrian even asked. "You passing through?" she said. Adrian shook his head. "Just moved in." "Into Pine Hollow?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him again, then nodded slowly. "Well, welcome then." The bell above the diner door jingled. Another man stepped inside. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad, with the relaxed posture of someone used to carrying authority without needing to show it. His coat carried a small badge on the chest. Sheriff Logan Pierce. Logan had the weathered look of someone who had lived outdoors most of his life. Light brown hair cut short, faint lines around his eyes, and the quiet confidence of a man who had once worn a uniform far more dangerous than a sheriff's badge. He stopped when he saw Adrian. Then he noticed Ranger. Logan walked closer. "You new in town?" he asked. His voice carried the calm steadiness of a man who preferred conversation over confrontation. Adrian nodded. "Adrian Vale." Logan extended his hand. "Logan Pierce, Sheriff." Their handshake was firm, quick. Logan noticed things. The worn tactical shirt, the boots, the posture. "Military?" Logan asked quietly. "Was." Logan nodded once. He didn't ask more. People like them didn't need details to recognize each other. "Town's small," Logan said. "Word travels fast. If you need anything, stop by the station." His gaze shifted to Ranger. "Dog looks like he knows his job." "He does." Logan smiled faintly. "Good. Pine Hollow's quiet, but every town needs someone watching the door." Adrian wasn't sure whether he meant the sheriff's office or Ranger. Logan left a few minutes later, and Adrian finished his coffee. When they stepped outside again, the afternoon light had softened. Snow clouds drifted slowly across the mountains. Ranger paused near the truck. His ears lifted. Adrian followed his gaze. At the far end of the road stood a weathered wooden fence surrounding a small property. A man stood behind it, old, still, watching them. The man looked to be in his early 70s. He was tall for his age, but slightly stooped from years of labor. His hair was thin and silver gray, cut short but uneven like he trimmed it himself. His face was carved by deep lines, the kind formed by decades of cold wind and quiet grief. He wore a red flannel shirt beneath a worn brown work jacket, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms toughened by years of woodworking. Jeans faded from years of use, and heavy leather boots completed the look. His eyes were sharp, hard, and fixed directly on Adrian. This was Silas Boone, the old carpenter. Even from across the road, Adrian could feel the weight of that stare. Ranger stepped forward slightly. Not aggressive, just curious. The dog's tail remained still. Silas' gaze dropped to Ranger. His expression hardened immediately. Adrian walked closer to the truck. Ranger followed. But the dog glanced back once more. Silas suddenly spoke. His voice carried across the quiet road like the snap of dry wood. "Keep that dog away from my place." The words weren't shouted, but they weren't friendly either. Adrian paused. For a moment the wind moved softly through the pine trees. Then Adrian gave a short nod. "Understood." He opened the truck door. Ranger jumped inside. Adrian climbed in behind the wheel and started the engine. As the truck pulled away, Ranger turned his head toward the back window. Silas Boone still stood by the fence, watching. Not angry, not curious. Something else. Something older. Adrian drove slowly down the road toward his new house on the edge of town. The cabin was small, built from aged pine logs, with a narrow porch facing the forest. Snow rested lightly on the roof and steps. It looked quiet. Simple. The kind of place a man could disappear into. Adrian stepped out of the truck and stretched his shoulders. Ranger hopped down beside him. The dog walked slowly around the yard, nose low to the ground. Then he stopped. His ears lifted. He looked back toward the direction of Silas Boone's house. Adrian followed the gaze, but all he saw was forest. The wind moved through the trees. Nothing else. Ranger remained still for several seconds. Then he turned and returned to Adrian's side. Adrian crouched and scratched the dog behind the ears. "You sensing ghosts now?" he murmured. Ranger simply leaned into his hand. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long, golden light across Pine Hollow. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood. Once. Then silence returned. Adrian stood on the porch of his new home, looking out over the quiet northern town. For the first time in a long time. The world didn't feel like a battlefield, but something in Ranger's steady gaze suggested that peace here might not come easily. And somewhere beyond the trees, an old carpenter stood in his yard, staring toward the forest with the same quiet unease. Neither man knew it yet, but their lives had already begun to turn toward each other. Morning in Pine Hollow arrived quietly, like someone opening a curtain rather than ringing a bell. The sky held a pale northern blue, and sunlight spilled across the tops of the pine trees surrounding Adrian Vale's small cabin. Snow that had settled during the night now melted slowly along the edges of the porch, dripping in steady rhythms from the roof. Adrian stepped outside with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Cold air brushed across his face, the kind of cold that didn't bite. It woke you up. Ranger followed him onto the porch, stepping lightly despite his size. The German shepherd stretched first front legs forward, chest low, tail lifted before standing beside Adrian. His thick sable coat shimmered slightly in the early sunlight, cream and gray blending into deeper shades of black along his back. The dog's amber eyes scanned the yard slowly, always alert, always aware. Adrian leaned against the wooden railing of the porch. He had slept better than expected. For months after leaving the service, sleep had come like a reluctant visitor arriving late, leaving early. But the quiet of Pine Hollow carried a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It felt safe. Ranger stepped down into the yard and began circling slowly, nose brushing across the ground. He moved with the deliberate patience of a working dog checking the edges of the property, as if drawing invisible lines of protection. Adrian watched him with a faint smile. "Go ahead," he murmured. Ranger trotted toward the tree line at the edge of the property, then returned a moment later, satisfied. The town itself lay only a few minutes away by truck. Adrian finished his coffee and headed into town soon after. Main Street looked brighter in daylight. A few cars rolled slowly along the road. Snowplows had cleared most of the pavement, leaving dark stripes of asphalt cutting through the remaining frost. The pickup parked outside Caldwell's kitchen again. Inside, the diner buzzed with quiet conversation. Martha Caldwell moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing a tray of coffee cups in one hand. When she noticed Adrian, her face lit with recognition. "Well, look who decided to stay another day," she said with a warm grin. Her voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades feeding half the town. "Morning," Adrian said. Ranger followed him inside, pausing just beyond the doorway before sitting beside the table Adrian chose. Several people in the diner glanced toward the dog. Not fearful, just curious. One of them, a young woman standing behind the counter, watched Ranger closely. She was in her late 20s, tall and slender, with long blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail. Her skin carried the pale tone common in northern towns, and faint freckles dotted the bridge of her nose. Her name was Lily Hart. Lily had grown up in Pine Hollow and now helped Martha run the diner. Her movements were quick but careful, and she had the calm patience of someone used to listening more than speaking. She leaned slightly across the counter. "Is he friendly?" she asked. Ranger turned his head toward her, his ears tilted slightly forward. Adrian nodded. "He's trained." Lily stepped around the counter slowly, crouching a few feet away from Ranger rather than approaching directly. "Hi there," she said softly. Ranger watched her carefully. Then his tail gave a single slow wag. "Guess that's approval," Lily said with a small smile. Martha set a plate of eggs and toast in front of Adrian. "Town's been talking about you already," she said casually. "That's so?" "Small place," Martha replied. "News travels faster than winter storms." She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned slightly closer. "Sheriff Pierce says you're good people." Adrian shrugged. "Hope that's enough?" Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "For most folks around here, it is, but not for everyone." The diner door opened again. Cold air slipped inside. A tall man stepped through the doorway, brushing snow from his coat. His posture carried an easy arrogance, shoulders wide, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning the room like he owned half of it. This was Caleb Turner. Caleb was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and well-dressed in a heavy wool coat, far nicer than most people in Pine Hollow wore. His dark hair had begun to gray at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his mouth. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in the area, and he knew it. Caleb's gaze moved across the diner until it landed on Ranger. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's your dog?" he asked Adrian. Adrian nodded. Caleb took a step closer, studying the German shepherd carefully. "That's a big animal to keep around town?" His tone sounded polite, but there was something sharp beneath it. "Working dog," Adrian replied. Caleb crossed his arms. "Working where?" Adrian met his gaze calmly. "Wherever I am." A faint murmur moved through the diner. Martha cleared her throat quietly, sensing tension. Caleb smiled thinly. "Well," he said, "Pine Hollow's a peaceful place. Folks like to keep it that way." Adrian didn't answer. He simply returned to his breakfast. Caleb lingered another moment, then turned toward the counter. But his eyes flicked once more toward Ranger. Suspicious. The morning passed slowly. Adrian spent the next hour walking along the lake road with Ranger beside him. Pine Hollow felt different in daylight. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Old pickup trucks rattled past with familiar waves exchanged between drivers. A man in his 70s repaired a wooden bench outside the hardware store. The town moved slowly, but it moved together. Ranger trotted slightly ahead on the path, nose lifting occasionally toward the breeze coming off the lake. Suddenly he stopped, completely still. His ears rose sharply. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger stared toward the tree line across the road. The wind moved softly through the branches. Nothing else stirred. Adrian waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then Ranger turned his head slightly, not toward the trees, toward the direction of Silas Boone's property. Adrian followed his gaze. The road between them looked empty, but Ranger remained tense. Ranger stepped off the path and walked several paces toward the woods. Then he stopped beside a fallen pine branch half buried in snow. The dog lowered his head and sniffed once. Then he sat, quietly, as if guarding something. Adrian approached slowly. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the wind shifted. A faint scent drifted through the air. Smoke. Not strong. Not dangerous. Just distant. Adrian looked toward the mountains. Somewhere far beyond the forest ridge, a thin gray line of smoke rose into the sky. Ranger continued watching the horizon. Still. Patient. As if he knew the mountain had begun whispering something the town had not heard yet. After a moment, the dog stood and returned calmly to Adrian's side. They walked back toward town. Adrian glanced once more toward the distant smoke, probably a farmer burning brush. Still, something about Ranger's reaction lingered in his mind. By afternoon, Pine Hollow had returned to its slow rhythm. Adrian stopped by the hardware store for supplies. The elderly man fixing the bench outside introduced himself as George Ellery, a retired mechanic with oil-stained hands and a voice roughened by decades of mountain winters. George was short and stocky, with a white mustache that drooped over the corners of his mouth. "Sheriff says you're the new fellow up by the old Carter cabin," he said. "That's right." George nodded approvingly. "Good place. Quiet." Ranger sat beside Adrian as they spoke. George chuckled. "That dog of yours watches people like a deputy. Sometimes he's better at it," Adrian replied. George laughed. "Sheriff Pierce will like you." As Adrian walked back toward the truck, he noticed someone standing across the street. Silas Boone. The old carpenter leaned against the wooden fence surrounding his yard. His posture was rigid. Watching. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes. This time his gaze was fixed not on Adrian, but on Ranger. For a moment, neither man spoke. The street between them lay silent. Ranger stepped slightly forward beside Adrian. Silas noticed the movement. His jaw tightened. Then he turned away without a word and disappeared into the yard. Adrian exhaled quietly. "Friendly place," he muttered. Ranger's tail flicked once, as if amused. The truck started with a low rumble. By the time Adrian reached the cabin again, evening had begun to settle across Pine Hollow. Golden light filtered through the pines. Ranger moved around the yard again, slower this time, more relaxed. Adrian leaned against the porch railing, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. For the first time in months, his thoughts felt quiet. No alarms, no echoes of gunfire, just wind, just trees, just a town learning who he was. But somewhere beyond the forest, that thin ribbon of smoke still drifted into the sky. And Ranger, standing beside the porch steps, watched the mountains a little longer than usual, as if listening for something no one else could hear. Morning light reached Pine Hollow slowly, sliding down from the mountain ridges like a careful hand across the roofs of the town. Adrian Vale woke before sunrise. Old habits had a way of lingering long after a man left the uniform behind. His body still kept the quiet schedule of a soldier awake before the world, listening before moving. The cabin felt colder that morning, not uncomfortable, just honest. Adrian pulled on his worn tactical shirt and stepped outside onto the porch. The air smelled of pine sap and damp wood. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a crow called once, its voice echoing through the trees. Ranger followed him out a moment later. The German shepherd moved lightly across the porch boards, his thick sable coat catching the early gray light. Cream and charcoal tones ran along his body like shadows laid over snow. He paused near the steps, nose lifted, testing the morning. Adrian leaned against the railing and took a long breath. For a few seconds, he simply listened. No distant traffic, no helicopters, no sharp radio chatter slicing the silence, just wind and forest. Ranger stepped down into the yard and circled once along the perimeter before returning to Adrian's side. His amber eyes moved, constantly tracking birds, drifting snow, small movements in the trees. "Same routine," Adrian murmured. Ranger flicked an ear. The dog understood tone more than words. After breakfast, Adrian headed into town again. The truck rolled slowly along the road toward Main Street, tires crunching lightly over thin frost. Pine Hollow looked busier than yesterday, pickup trucks parked outside the hardware store, 2 kids riding bicycles past the post office, a delivery van unloading crates of produce near Caldwell's kitchen. Life moved here like a steady river. Not fast, but strong. Adrian parked near the hardware store. Ranger jumped down beside him, landing with quiet confidence. The dog's posture shifted immediately, shoulders forward, eyes scanning the street. A working dog never truly relaxed, even on peaceful streets. Adrian stepped into the hardware store. Inside smelled of sawdust and machine oil. Shelves held rows of tools, bolts, rope, and winter supplies. The place looked exactly the way a northern hardware store should, practical, cluttered, and dependable. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a square frame and weathered face. This was Arthur Bennett, the owner. Arthur looked about 50, thick through the shoulders with hands that had clearly spent decades gripping hammers and wrenches. His beard was peppered gray and trimmed short, and his eyes carried the calm patience of someone who had watched the town grow for years. He noticed Adrian immediately. "You're the fellow in the Carter cabin," Arthur said. Adrian nodded. "That's me." Arthur's gaze drifted toward Ranger, sitting near the door. "Well, I'll be," Arthur chuckled softly. "That dog sits straighter than half the deputies I know." Ranger remained still. Arthur stepped around the counter and crouched slightly, offering the back of his hand for the dog to smell. Ranger leaned forward, sniffed, then sat back again. Arthur grinned. "Smart one." He stood again. "What can I help you with?" Adrian picked up a few supplies wood screws, a box of nails, and a replacement latch for the shed behind his cabin. As Arthur rang up the items, he glanced toward the window. "You met Silas Boone yet?" he asked. Adrian paused briefly. "Seen him?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Not the easiest man to get along with." Adrian waited. Arthur leaned against the counter. "Lost his boy years ago," he said quietly. "Ethan Boone. Good kid. Army Ranger." The name carried weight. Adrian felt it. Arthur continued. "Silas hasn't been the same since." Adrian didn't ask more. Some stories explained themselves. When Adrian stepped outside again, Ranger rose instantly and fell into step beside him. The dog moved slightly closer to Adrian's leg than usual, protective or curious. As they crossed the street, Adrian noticed movement near the end of the block. A tall man stood beside a wooden fence. Silas Boone. The old carpenter's property sat on the edge of town, where the paved road gave way to gravel and forest. His house was older than most buildings in Pine Hollow, thick pine logs darkened by years of weather. Behind the house stood the workshop, a separate structure with a wide sliding door and a roof patched in several places. Adrian slowed his steps. Silas noticed. The old man leaned against the fence with his arms folded across his chest. His posture was rigid but balanced, like a man who had spent years lifting heavy wood and tools. Deep lines marked his face, each one telling a story the town likely knew by heart. His silver-gray hair was unevenly cut. His eyes were sharp, guarded, and right now they were fixed on Ranger. Adrian approached slowly. "Morning," he said. Silas didn't respond at first. The old man's gaze moved slowly from Ranger up to Adrian's face. "You letting that animal run loose around town?" Silas asked. His voice was rough like wood dragged across stone. "No," Adrian replied calmly. "He stays with me." Silas nodded once, still studying the dog. Ranger stood quietly, not tense, just aware. The wind shifted slightly through the trees behind the property. Adrian caught the faint scent of pine resin and old sawdust. From the open workshop door, he could see stacks of lumber leaning against the wall. Tools hung from wooden racks. The place looked untouched for years. Silas noticed Adrian looking. "My shop," he said flatly. Adrian nodded. "Looks like good work was done there." Silas snorted softly. "Was." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then something unexpected happened. Ranger stepped forward, slowly. Not toward Silas, toward the open workshop door. The dog stopped just outside the entrance and sat down, still, watching the interior of the building. Ranger's head tilted slightly. He sniffed the air once. Then he walked inside the workshop without hesitation. Adrian blinked. "Ranger." Silas moved instantly. "Hey." The old man stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. But Ranger didn't touch anything. He walked slowly across the dusty wooden floor until he reached the center of the room. Then he stopped and lay down, directly beside an old wooden workbench. The movement was calm, almost respectful. Adrian stepped into the doorway. Sunlight from the open door revealed the inside of the shop more clearly now. The workbench was covered in a thin layer of dust, but one object sat on top of it. A small wooden box, half finished. Adrian glanced toward Silas. The old carpenter had gone very still. His eyes were no longer angry. They were distant. "That bench," Silas said quietly, his voice losing its edge, "was Ethan's." Adrian looked back at the unfinished box. Rough edges, careful joints. Work interrupted. Silas stepped into the workshop slowly. He stared at Ranger lying beside the bench. "That dog shouldn't be in here," he muttered. But he didn't tell Ranger to leave. Ranger lifted his head. His amber eyes met the old man's gaze. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Silas looked away. "Strange animal," he said. Adrian walked closer and gently touched Ranger's harness. The dog stood immediately and returned to his side. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "He used to bring his dog in here too," the old man said suddenly. Adrian didn't ask who. He knew. "Marlowe," Silas added. The name hung quietly in the air. "Old hunting dog," Silas continued. "Followed Ethan everywhere." He stared at the workbench again. "Haven't had a dog around since." Ranger shifted beside Adrian, but remained silent. Silas stepped past them and brushed dust from the workbench with a rag. For the first time, Adrian noticed the tremor in the old man's hands. Small, but real. "You fixing that shed of yours?" Silas asked suddenly. Adrian nodded. "Trying to." Silas gestured toward the supplies in Adrian's arms. "You bought the wrong latch." Adrian raised an eyebrow. Silas walked to a tool rack and grabbed another metal latch from a box. "This one'll hold through winter." He tossed it toward Adrian. Adrian caught it. "Appreciate it." Silas shrugged. "Just don't want that shed collapsing next storm." Adrian turned to leave. Ranger followed. As they stepped back into the daylight, Adrian glanced once more at the workshop. Silas stood alone beside the bench again. The unfinished box remained exactly where Ethan had left it. Adrian walked back toward the truck. Ranger looked back once. The dog's ears lifted slightly. Silas Boone stood in the doorway of the workshop watching them go. His expression was harder to read now. Not anger, not friendliness. Something else. Something quieter. Adrian started the engine. The truck rolled slowly down the road toward his cabin. Beside him, Ranger settled into the seat. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, Adrian had the strange feeling that something invisible had shifted. Not much, just enough to be noticed. And somewhere behind them in the old workshop, a man who had spent years avoiding memories now stood beside the last project his son ever started. The weather in Pine Hollow could change faster than a man finished a cup of coffee. One morning, the sky could be wide and pale blue above the pine ridges, sunlight slipping through branches like warm water. By afternoon, the mountains could darken. Adrian Vale noticed the shift before most people did. He stood on the porch of his cabin with a hammer in one hand and a strip of fresh wood balanced against the railing. The shed behind the cabin still needed work, and the new latch Silas Boone had tossed him the day before rested in his pocket. Ranger sat nearby in the yard, watching. The German shepherd had positioned himself where he could see both the road and the tree line. His sable coat rippled slightly whenever a breeze passed through the clearing. Adrian drove the last nail into place and leaned back. The air smelled different. moist, heavy. He looked toward the mountains. Dark clouds gathered along the ridge like slow-moving ships. "Storm's coming," Adrian murmured. Ranger lifted his head. The dog had already noticed. By midday, the sky above Pine Hollow had dimmed to a dull gray. The wind picked up, pushing cold air down through the forest and across the lake. Adrian drove into town just as the first drops of rain began tapping against the windshield. Main Street felt busier than usual. People moved quickly between shops. Pickup trucks rolled past with tarps covering supplies. Pine Hollow might have been a small town, but mountain weather had taught its residents to prepare early. Ranger stepped out of the truck and shook rain from his coat. They headed into Caldwell's kitchen. Inside, the diner buzzed with louder conversation than usual. Martha Caldwell stood near the counter organizing stacks of plates. The strong, silver-threaded woman moved quickly despite the rush, her sharp eyes catching every empty cup and half-finished plate in the room. "Looks like the mountain's waking up," she said as Adrian stepped in. Adrian glanced toward the window. Rain streaked the glass. "Looks that way." Lily Hart carried a tray of coffee past them. The tall young woman moved gracefully between tables, blonde ponytail swinging lightly behind her. She paused when she saw Ranger and crouched briefly to scratch behind his ears. "You picked a good day to come into town," she said to Adrian. "Sheriff says the creek might swell if the rain keeps up." Adrian nodded slowly. Mountain creeks didn't ask permission before they flooded. They simply rose. Sheriff Logan Pierce sat near the far end of the diner, speaking quietly with two men from the volunteer fire department. Logan looked up when Adrian walked in. The sheriff lifted a hand. Adrian crossed the room. "Storm trouble?" Adrian asked. Logan leaned back in his chair. "Maybe. Hard to say yet." The sheriff looked like he hadn't slept much the night before. His square jaw carried a faint shadow of stubble, and the deep lines around his eyes seemed darker today. "Mountain snow's melting faster than expected," Logan added. "If the rain keeps pushing through, the lake road could flood." Adrian glanced toward the window again. The rain had begun falling harder now. Ranger shifted beside the table, ears turning slightly toward the door. He had started doing that more often. Listening. An hour later, the storm fully arrived. Wind rattled the diner windows. Rain pounded against the roof. The sky darkened until afternoon looked almost like evening. Sheriff Pierce stepped outside several times to check conditions. Each time he returned with deeper lines in his forehead. By late afternoon, the call finally came. The creek near the lower road had overflowed. Water rushed down from the mountains faster than expected, spilling across the road and flooding the small fields near the edge of town. Logan stood up quickly. "Everyone listen," he called across the diner. Conversation stopped immediately. "We need volunteers down by the lower road," the sheriff said. "Water's rising fast." Chairs scraped against the floor as several men stood. Adrian was already moving. "I'll help," he said. Logan nodded. "Good." Ranger rose beside Adrian, ready. The lower road lay only a mile from town, but by the time they arrived, the scene had changed completely. Water spilled across the roadside ditch and spread into the nearby yards. Muddy currents pushed through fences and around trees, carrying branches and debris down the slope. The rain continued falling. Volunteers formed lines, stacking sandbags along the edge of the road to redirect the flow. Adrian joined them immediately. His body slipped back into familiar rhythm lift, step, place, repeat. Years of military training had taught him how to move efficiently in chaos. Ranger stayed nearby, watching carefully. The dog moved along the edges of the work zone, weaving between volunteers with surprising patience. His harness glistened under the rain. Sheriff Pierce directed traffic and shouted instructions. "Keep the bags tight," he called. "Don't leave gaps." For a while, the work held. The sandbag wall slowed the water, but storms in the mountains rarely listened to human plans. A sudden shout rose from the far side of the road. "Someone's missing!" Adrian turned instantly. A woman ran toward Logan through the rain. Her coat was soaked, and panic filled her voice. "My boy, Noah, he was playing near the sheds earlier." Adrian recognized her immediately. Sarah Walker. Sarah was in her early 30s, slender and pale, with dark brown hair plastered against her face by the rain. Her eyes carried the exhausted worry of a single mother who had spent years raising a child alone after her husband died in a logging accident. Her son Noah was the quiet boy who liked Ranger. Logan stepped forward. "When did you last see him?" "An hour ago," Sarah cried. "Near the storage sheds by the hill." Adrian looked toward the row of wooden sheds behind the flooded field. Water had already begun creeping toward them. Ranger suddenly froze. The dog's ears shot forward. Without warning, he bolted, straight toward the sheds. "Ranger!" Adrian shouted. But the dog didn't stop. His powerful body cut through the rain and mud with incredible speed. Within seconds, he disappeared behind the nearest shed. Adrian followed immediately. Water splashed around his boots as he ran. He rounded the corner of the shed and heard it. A small voice. Crying. Ranger stood beside a narrow wooden door at the back of the shed, barking sharply now. Adrian pulled the door open. Inside, curled against the wall, sat Noah Walker. The boy's small shoulders shook with fear. "I couldn't get out," Noah whispered. Adrian knelt. "You're okay now." Ranger stepped forward and gently nudged the boy's arm with his nose. Noah wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. "I knew he'd find me," he said. Adrian lifted Noah and carried him back toward the road. The rain had begun easing slightly, but the floodwaters still moved quickly through the fields. Sarah ran forward the moment she saw them. "Oh, thank God!" She hugged Noah tightly, tears mixing with rain on her face. Ranger stood beside them quietly, tail wagging slowly. Sheriff Pierce exhaled heavily. "That dog just saved us hours of searching," he said. Adrian scratched behind Ranger's ears. "Just doing his job." The volunteers finished reinforcing the sandbag wall as the storm finally began to weaken. By evening, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Water still ran through the ditches, but the worst of the flooding had passed. People began packing up tools and equipment. As Adrian loaded the last sandbags onto the truck, he noticed someone standing near the edge of the field. Silas Boone. The old carpenter leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching. He had likely been there longer than anyone realized. Ranger noticed him, too. The dog walked several steps closer before stopping. Silas studied the German shepherd silently. Then he glanced toward Noah, who sat wrapped in his mother's coat. "You found the boy," Silas said quietly. Ranger wagged his tail once. Silas nodded slowly. "Good dog." It was the first kind thing Adrian had heard the old man say about Ranger. Adrian watched Silas carefully. The carpenter turned away after a moment and walked back toward the road leading to his property. But something in his expression had changed. The storm clouds broke just enough for a thin beam of sunset light to slip across Pine Hollow. Adrian stood beside the truck and watched the town slowly return to calm. Ranger sat beside him, rain dripping from his coat. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood again. One steady tap, then another. Life in Pine Hollow continued. But tonight, the town would remember the dog who had found the lost boy in the storm. And the old carpenter who had once refused to look at that dog had just spoken 2 quiet words that carried more weight than most people realized. Good dog. The morning after the storm arrived with a strange quiet. Pine Hollow looked washed clean. Rain had swept the dust from the roads, and the air smelled sharper than usual pine needles, wet soil, and distant lake water. Sunlight slipped between clouds and scattered across rooftops, still glistening with droplets. Adrian Vale stepped out of his cabin just after dawn. He paused on the porch, letting the cool air fill his lungs. For a moment he simply listened. No rushing water anymore. No heavy wind. Just the slow creaking of trees, shifting in the breeze. Ranger came out beside him. The German shepherd shook the last moisture from his coat, sending a small spray of water across the wooden boards. His sable fur layers of cream, gray, and black caught the morning light in shifting patterns. He looked calmer today, but his eyes still carried that steady awareness. Adrian scratched behind the dog's ears. You caused quite a stir yesterday. Ranger wagged his tail once. Adrian wasn't sure if the dog understood the words, but he understood the tone. They drove into town a little later. The storm had left its mark, mud along the lower road, broken branches scattered near the lake, but Pine Hollow was already moving again. Small towns were like that. They bent with trouble, then stood back up. Adrian stopped near Silas Boone's property before reaching Main Street. The old carpenter's fence still leaned slightly from the wind, but the house itself looked solid as ever. The workshop door stood open. That was new. Adrian stepped out of the truck. Ranger jumped down beside him. The dog walked a few paces toward the open doorway, but waited for Adrian to follow. Inside, the workshop smelled of sawdust and oil. The interior looked different than it had before. Dust still lingered across the beams and shelves, but a narrow path had been cleared through the clutter. Tools hung neatly along the wall again, chisels, planes, old hand saws with wooden handles worn smooth by years of use. Silas Boone stood at the workbench. The old carpenter had rolled up the sleeves of his red flannel shirt, revealing strong forearms marked with pale scars from decades of work. His gray hair stuck out unevenly, and his face carried the tired focus of a man trying not to think too much. He sanded the edge of a wooden board slowly. The unfinished box still rested on the bench. Silas noticed Adrian in the doorway. You planning to stand there all day? He said without looking up. Adrian stepped inside. Just checking if the storm knocked anything loose. Silas grunted. Storm wasn't strong enough for that. Ranger moved quietly across the floor and sat near the workbench again. Silas glanced at him briefly. You let him wander into every workshop you see? He seems to like this one. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. Dog's got strange taste, but he didn't tell Ranger to leave. For a while, the only sound in the shop was the soft scrape of sandpaper across wood. Adrian leaned against the doorway frame. You used to build a lot here, he said. Silas nodded. Used to. The old man brushed sawdust from the board and set it aside. Then he walked toward the back of the workshop. A narrow hallway opened behind a tall shelf stacked with lumber. Adrian hadn't noticed it before. Silas pushed the shelf slightly aside. Come on, he muttered. Adrian followed. Ranger rose immediately and walked behind them. The hallway led to a small room at the rear of the building. The air inside felt cooler, quieter. Sunlight slipped through a narrow window, illuminating a collection of objects carefully arranged along the walls. Military photographs, medals, a folded American flag resting inside a glass case. Adrian slowed. The room clearly belonged to Ethan Boone. Silas stood beside the window. "He kept some of his things here," the old man said. His voice sounded different now, lower. Adrian studied the photographs. One showed a younger man standing beside a helicopter in desert camouflage. Ethan Boone had been tall, broad-shouldered, and smiling in that quiet way soldiers sometimes did when they weren't sure the camera belonged there. Another photo showed Ethan sitting on the workshop floor beside a black hunting dog. Marlowe. The dog looked older, heavy-chested, with bright eyes and a thick coat. Adrian crouched slightly to look closer. Ranger stepped forward beside him. The German shepherd studied the photograph carefully. Then something unexpected happened. Ranger lowered his nose toward the floor. He began sniffing slowly across the wooden boards. Once. Twice. Then he stopped beside a small wooden chest pushed against the wall. The dog sat, perfectly still. Adrian noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger looked back at him. Silas frowned. "That box hasn't been opened in years," the old carpenter said. Adrian lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay several objects wrapped in old cloth. A worn military patch, a folded map, and a dog tag. Adrian picked up the metal tag. The engraving caught the light. Ethan Boone. For a moment, the room felt very quiet. Silas stared at the tag. "He kept that here after his last leave," the old man said. His voice cracked slightly. Ranger rested his head gently against Silas's leg. The old carpenter froze. He looked down at the dog. Then slowly, very slowly, he placed a rough hand on Ranger's head. The gesture lasted only a second. But it happened. Silas cleared his throat and stepped away. "That's enough for today," he muttered. They returned to the main workshop. Sunlight had grown stronger outside. The storm clouds were gone now. Adrian walked toward the door. "You ever finish that box?" he asked. Silas glanced toward the workbench. The unfinished wooden box still waited there. "Ethan started it," the old man said. "He said it was for storing small tools." Adrian studied the joints. Careful work. Precise. "You could finish it." Silas shook his head. "No." The word came too quickly. Adrian didn't press. Ranger walked beside him as they stepped back into the yard. The dog paused near the door. He looked once more toward the workbench, then followed Adrian. Silas stood inside the workshop, watching them leave. The afternoon sun stretched across the property, lighting the edges of the tools and boards stacked along the walls. Adrian reached the truck. Before climbing in, he glanced back. Silas had returned to the bench. The old carpenter picked up a chisel. He studied the unfinished box for a long time. Then, slowly, he set the chisel down beside it. Adrian drove toward town again. Ranger settled into the passenger seat. For a few minutes, neither of them moved. Then Adrian smiled faintly. "Think you're making a friend?" Ranger's tail tapped against the seat. Back in the workshop, Silas Boone remained standing beside the bench. The unfinished box waited. The old man reached out and brushed a thin layer of dust from its surface. He didn't say anything. But the workshop that had slept for years now felt slightly less empty. The dry heat came quietly. At first, no one in Pine Hollow noticed it. The rain from the previous storm had left the ground damp for days, and the mountains above the town still carried patches of lingering snow where shadows held the cold. But by late summer, the forest had changed. The wind grew warmer. Pine needles dried beneath the trees, and the air sometimes carried the faint, brittle smell of sap and sun-baked bark. Adrian Vale noticed it during one of his morning walks with Ranger. The two of them followed a narrow path behind the cabin that wound along the lower ridge. The ground crunched softly beneath Adrian's boots, where dry needles covered the trail. Ranger moved ahead of him, the German shepherd's ears turning constantly toward every sound in the forest. Birds, squirrels, the distant tapping of a woodpecker. The dog paused suddenly near a fallen log. Adrian slowed. "What is it?" Ranger sniffed the air carefully. The breeze shifted. For a moment, the forest smelled perfectly normal, pine and soil and sunlight. Then the wind changed direction again. A thin scent drifted down from the mountains. Smoke, faint, far away. Adrian lifted his head. The sky above the ridge looked clear, but the smell lingered. Ranger stood very still beside him, watching the trees. By afternoon, Pine Hollow buzzed with quiet rumors. Someone had spotted a column of smoke rising beyond the northern hills. The volunteer fire department had already driven out to investigate, but the mountains were vast and the road network thin. Sheriff Logan Pierce stood outside the station speaking with two firefighters when Adrian arrived. Logan's posture looked tense. "Brush fire," the sheriff said when Adrian approached. "How bad?" "Hard to tell yet." Logan wiped sweat from his brow. The day had grown unusually warm, and even the breeze carried heat down from the slopes. "Wind's pushing south," Logan continued. "If it spreads through the dry pines." He didn't finish the sentence. Adrian didn't need him to. Mountain fires moved fast, too fast sometimes. Ranger sat quietly beside Adrian, amber eyes focused on the sheriff's voice. The dog sensed the tension in the air. The entire town felt it. By early evening, the sky above Pine Hollow had begun to change. A faint gray haze drifted across the distant mountains. It wasn't thick yet, but it blurred the sharp line of the ridges. People gathered along Main Street, pointing toward the hills. Sheriff Pierce organized evacuation routes just in case. The volunteer firefighters returned briefly for more equipment before heading back up the mountain roads. Adrian spent the next hour helping move supplies from the hardware store into the fire trucks. Arthur Bennett worked beside him, his thick arms carrying crates of tools and hoses with steady determination. Arthur wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Never liked fire season," he muttered. "None of us do." Nearby, Caleb Turner stood beside his expensive truck, speaking sharply into his phone. The wealthy landowner looked irritated rather than worried, his dark beard trimmed neatly and his coat thrown casually across his shoulders despite the heat. "This will burn out before it reaches town," Caleb insisted to someone on the line. But the wind disagreed. The breeze strengthened as evening approached, and the smoke thickened. Adrian noticed someone standing quietly near the edge of the crowd. Silas Boone. The old carpenter had arrived without anyone noticing. His red flannel shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the lines on his weathered face looked deeper in the smoky light. He stood with his arms folded, watching the mountains. Ranger saw him immediately. The German shepherd walked toward him slowly, Silas glanced down at the dog. "You again?" he muttered. Ranger sat beside him. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Silas scratched the back of the dog's neck with rough fingers. A small gesture, but a different one than before. Adrian noticed. The distance between the old carpenter and the dog had begun to disappear. The fire moved faster than anyone expected. Around sunset, the wind shifted sharply. Smoke rolled down from the mountain ridge in thicker waves now, drifting across the forest toward Pine Hollow. Sheriff Pierce stepped onto the hood of his truck and called out, "Everyone listen!" Conversations stopped immediately. "We're starting evacuation for the northern homes," Logan said. "If the fire crosses the lower ridge, we'll need the roads clear." People moved quickly. Pine Hollow had practiced this before. Cars began loading supplies. Families gathered children and pets. Adrian helped Arthur secure the last of the equipment when he noticed something strange. Silas Boone was no longer standing near the crowd. He scanned the street. The old carpenter was gone. Ranger noticed it too. The dog's ears rose sharply. He turned toward the road leading out of town, the narrow path that wound back toward Silas's property. Ranger whined once. Adrian felt a sudden tightness in his chest. "Where'd he go?" he muttered. Without warning, Ranger sprinted. The German shepherd bolted down the road toward the forest at full speed. "Ranger!" Adrian ran after him. The dog's powerful body moved like a shadow between the trees, weaving through brush and fallen branches. Adrian followed as fast as he could. The smell of smoke grew stronger with every step. Then he saw it. Silas Boone's workshop. Smoke drifted across the clearing behind it, and the old carpenter stood near the open door, struggling to drag something heavy across the floor. Adrian reached the doorway, just as Silas lifted a wooden crate. "What are you doing?" Adrian shouted. Silas didn't look up. "Getting Ethan's things." The room already smelled of smoke now. Ash floated through the open door like gray snow. "You need to leave," Adrian said. "Not without this." Silas dragged the crate toward the door. Ranger darted inside and began barking sharply. The dog's voice echoed through the workshop. Then Adrian heard it. A loud crack. A burning branch had fallen against the far side of the roof. Fire licked along the dry shingles. Silas froze. Adrian grabbed his arm. "Now we go." For a moment, the old carpenter resisted. Then he looked at the flames spreading along the roof, and nodded. They carried the crate together out of the workshop. Ranger ran ahead toward the road, barking again to guide them through the thickening smoke. The fire crews arrived just minutes later. Sirens echoed through the trees as engines raced up the road toward the ridge. Volunteers began spraying water along the edge of the property to stop the flames from spreading further downhill. Adrian helped Silas set the crate safely inside the back of his truck. The old carpenter leaned heavily against the tailgate, breathing hard. Smoke clung to his flannel shirt. "You all right?" Adrian asked. Silas nodded slowly. His eyes moved toward Ranger. The dog sat nearby, chest rising and falling calmly. Silas walked toward him. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then he placed both hands on the dog's head. "You stubborn animal," he said quietly. Ranger wagged his tail. The fire crews eventually contained the blaze along the ridge before it could reach the town. Night fell slowly over Pine Hollow. Smoke still lingered in the air, but the worst danger had passed. Adrian sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the firefighters work. Silas sat beside him. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Silas looked toward the dark outline of his workshop. "That box," he said. Adrian glanced at him. "The one Ethan started." Silas rubbed his hands together slowly. "I think it's time I finished it." Ranger rested his head against the old carpenter's knee. Silas didn't pull away. The firelight flickered across the trees as the last flames along the ridge died down. For the first time in many years, Silas Boone did not feel alone standing beside his son's workshop. And Adrian realized something quietly powerful. Sometimes the things that bring people together are not the peaceful days, but the fires they survive. Morning came gently to Pine Hollow after the fire. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air, drifting in thin ribbons above the distant tree line, but the danger had passed. The forest above the ridge carried black scars where the flames had crawled through dry pine needles and fallen branches, yet the town itself remained untouched. Sunlight spread slowly across the valley. Adrian Vale stood on the porch of his cabin, holding a mug of coffee that had long since cooled in his hand. The morning felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just settled. Ranger lay at the top of the porch steps, head resting between his paws. The German shepherd's amber eyes watched the yard, while the breeze lifted the edges of his thick sable coat. The dog had slept lightly through the night. Adrian could tell. Ranger always rested that way after danger had passed, alert, but calmer. Adrian finally took a sip of the coffee. It tasted cold. He didn't mind. His thoughts drifted back to the ridge where the fire had burned, then to Silas Boone's workshop, and the crate they had carried out together. The memory lingered like the last warmth of a dying campfire. Ranger lifted his head. Someone was coming. Adrian heard the truck before he saw it. A dusty pickup rolled slowly up the gravel road toward the cabin and stopped beside the porch. The driver stepped out. Silas Boone. The old carpenter looked the same as always: red flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, boots worn smooth by decades of work. But something in his posture had softened. The hard edge that had surrounded him when Adrian first arrived in Pine Hollow had worn down slightly. Silas carried something in both hands, a small wooden box. Adrian recognized it immediately. Ethan's box. Silas walked up the porch steps without speaking. Ranger stood. The German shepherd's tail wagged once, slow and steady. Silas noticed. "You always greet people like you know them already?" he muttered. Ranger sat down again. Silas set the wooden box carefully on the porch railing. The box looked different now. Finished. The edges had been sanded smooth. The joints fit together tightly, and the wood carried a warm, polished glow that caught the morning light. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "Figured I should finish it," he said. Adrian studied the box quietly. "You did good work." Silas snorted softly. "Ethan did most of it." Adrian didn't argue. Silas picked up the box again and opened the lid. Inside lay the small tools Ethan had once kept scattered across the workshop: bench chisels, carving knives, a measuring gauge. Silas closed the lid gently. "Been a long time since I worked that bench properly," he said. Adrian leaned against the porch railing. "What changed?" Silas glanced down at Ranger. "That dog of yours?" he said. Ranger blinked calmly. Silas shook his head. "Strangest thing I ever saw." Later that afternoon, the town gathered near the edge of Main Street. The volunteer firefighters had finished clearing the burned brush along the ridge, and Sheriff Logan Pierce had called a small community meeting to discuss repairs and prevention before the next fire season. People stood in loose groups near the town hall. Children ran between trucks. Neighbors spoke quietly about the events of the previous night. Adrian arrived with Ranger walking at his side. Several people waved. Sarah Walker stood near the steps with Noah beside her. The boy looked excited when he spotted Ranger. "Hey, buddy," Noah called. The boy ran over and hugged the dog around the neck. Ranger stood patiently while the child buried his face in the thick fur. Sarah followed more slowly. Her dark hair was tied loosely behind her head, and faint shadows beneath her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much since the storm and fire, but she smiled warmly. "I think Noah likes your partner more than he likes me these days," she said. Adrian chuckled. "Can't blame him." Sheriff Pierce climbed onto the back of his truck and addressed the crowd. The sheriff looked tired, but relieved. "We were lucky," Logan said. "The fire stopped before reaching town, but we're going to clear more brush along the ridge and set up new watch patrols." Heads nodded across the group. Pine Hollow had always handled its problems that way together. Adrian noticed Caleb Turner standing near the back of the crowd. The wealthy landowner still wore his expensive coat despite the warm afternoon, and his expression carried the same distant confidence as always. But even Caleb looked slightly less certain today. Perhaps the fire had reminded him that money didn't stop mountains from burning. Silas Boone stood quietly near the side of the gathering. Ranger walked toward him again. Silas crouched slightly and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Don't make a habit of this," he muttered. But the words carried no real resistance. As the meeting ended and people began drifting back toward their homes, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The dog turned slowly toward the ridge. For several seconds, he stared at the distant forest where the fire had burned. The wind moved gently through the valley. Adrian followed Ranger's gaze. Something about the dog's posture felt familiar. Not alarm, not fear, just attention. Then Ranger looked back at Adrian. His tail wagged once, and he sat down beside Silas Boone. The movement felt simple, but something about it made several people pause. Sheriff Pierce noticed too. The sheriff folded his arms and watched the scene quietly. Two men, one dog, standing together where strangers had once stood apart. By evening, Pine Hollow had returned almost entirely to normal. Smoke had thinned to faint threads above the mountains. The town lights flickered on, one by one, along Main Street. Adrian walked back toward his truck with Ranger beside him. Silas followed a few steps behind. They stopped near the road. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Silas cleared his throat. "You staying here long?" he asked. Adrian looked toward the mountains. "Wasn't planning to," he admitted. Silas nodded slowly. "Town could use someone who knows how to handle trouble." Adrian glanced down at Ranger. The dog's ears perked slightly. "What about you?" Adrian asked. Silas shrugged. "Been here my whole life." He looked toward the workshop road. "Guess I'll stay a while longer." Adrian smiled faintly. The three of them stood there as the evening sky deepened into shades of violet and blue. The air carried the scent of pine again. Clean. Quiet. Ranger leaned gently against Silas's leg. The old carpenter didn't move away. Instead, he rested one hand on the dog's back. For a long moment, the town of Pine Hollow felt perfectly still. No storms, no fire, just the quiet presence of people who had survived both. Adrian climbed into the truck. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat. Before starting the engine, Adrian looked once more toward Silas Boone, standing in the fading light. The old carpenter lifted a hand in a small wave. Adrian returned it. The truck rolled slowly down the road toward the cabin. Behind him, the lights of Pine Hollow glowed softly beneath the mountains. For the first time since arriving, Adrian realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't just passing through anymore. Somewhere between storms, fires, and quiet mornings, the town had begun to feel like home. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a small town, in the loyalty of a dog, in the patience of people who choose to care for each other even after life has broken their hearts. Adrian came to Pine Hollow carrying the weight of war. Silas Boone carried the silence of losing a son. Two wounded lives moving through the same quiet streets, not knowing that God often works in the smallest moments. A dog that refuses to leave someone's side. A neighbor who shows up when the storm comes. A stranger who becomes family. These are not accidents. Sometimes God does not remove our pain. Sometimes He sends someone to walk beside us through it. The truth is that many of us live like Adrian and Silas. We carry memories we rarely speak about. We lose people we love. We build walls around our hearts just to survive another day. But life has a quiet way of reminding us that we are not meant to walk alone. Maybe the miracle in your life will not look like a miracle at all. Maybe it will look like a loyal friend, a kind stranger, a second chance, or even a moment when your heart opens again after you believed it never could. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of this story spoke to your heart. And if you believe that stories like this remind us that goodness still exists in the world, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can find these stories of hope, courage, and quiet miracles. Before you go, take a moment and breathe. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your path when life feels uncertain. May He send people into your life who remind you that kindness still lives in this world. And may you never forget that even in the hardest seasons, miracles can still find their way home.